Picture this. A man is drowning, arms flailing, lungs burning, absolutely convinced this is how his story ends. And then, out of nowhere, a dolphin shows up, nudges him from below, and pushes him all the way to shore like it's just another Tuesday at the office. The guy survives. The dolphin swims off without so much as a wave goodbye. And somewhere, a marine biologist is sitting there thinking, okay, but why though? Because here's the thing that should be bugging you right now and probably isn't. Dolphins don't owe us anything. Neither do elephants or dogs or, weirdly enough, beluga whales. And yet, over and over again throughout recorded history, animals have gone out of their way, sometimes at real risk to themselves, to save human lives. So what's actually going on here? Stick around, because the answer involves evolutionary biology, some genuinely baffling animal behavior, and at least one story involving a whale that decided a human's dropped phone was a personal problem it needed to solve. Let's start by knocking down the assumption everyone brings to this topic without even realizing it, which is that animals rescuing humans must mean animals feel something like human compassion. It's a nice thought. It's also not quite right, or at least it's not the whole picture, and understanding why gets us somewhere way more interesting than just animals are secretly nice. Here's the first big piece of the puzzle. A lot of animal rescue behavior isn't actually rescue behavior at all, in the sense of an animal consciously deciding a human is in danger, I must help. Instead, it's the accidental byproduct of instincts that evolved for completely different reasons, instincts that just happen to look like heroism when a human ends up on the receiving end of them. Take dolphins, since they're basically the poster child for this entire phenomenon. Dolphins have a well-documented, deeply ingrained behavior of supporting injured or struggling members of their own pod at the surface of the water, physically pushing them upward so they can breathe. This isn't a cute personality quirk. It's a hardwired survival mechanism. Because dolphins are mammals, they need to breathe air, and a pod member who can't get to the surface is a pod member who's about to die. Evolution favored dolphins that helped their struggling packmates, because pods that supported injured members maintained stronger social bonds and better overall group survival. Now here's the twist. Dolphins, as far as researchers can tell, don't seem to have a strict, hard-coded filter that says, only do this for other dolphins. The instinct is something closer to living creature, struggling at the surface, needs pushing upward. And a drowning human, thrashing around in open water, apparently trips that exact same wire. You're not getting rescued because the dolphin recognized your humanity and made a moral judgment call. You're getting rescued because you look enough like a distressed pod member that ancient dolphin instincts kick in on autopilot. And honestly, once you know that, it recontextualizes basically every dolphin rescue story you've ever heard in a way that's somehow both less magical and significantly more fascinating. It's not that dolphins have some deep, mystical connection with humanity. It's that we accidentally look enough like large mammal in trouble to activate a rescue instinct that's been running in the background of dolphin brains for millions of years, built for an entirely different species. There's a certain cosmic comedy to that, honestly. You almost drowned, and the reason you're alive is that a dolphin briefly mistook you for one of its cousins. Not exactly the heartwarming narrative you'd put on a greeting card, but arguably even more interesting. Okay, so that explains dolphins reasonably well. But dolphins aren't the only animals doing this, not even close. And some of the other cases are honestly a lot weirder because the mistaken identity explanation doesn't cover everything. Let's talk about dogs, because dogs might actually be the single best case study for understanding why this topic is so much more layered than it first appears. Dogs have been living alongside humans for somewhere between 15 and 40,000 years, depending on which archaeological estimate you trust, which makes them, by a wide margin, the longest-running interspecies relationship humans have ever maintained. And over that absurdly long stretch of cohabitation, something genuinely unique happened to dogs. Something that didn't happen to wolves, their closest wild relative, despite sharing something like 99% of their DNA. Dogs developed the ability to read human emotional and behavioral cues with a level of sophistication that borders on unsettling. Studies have shown dogs can follow human pointing gestures, something even chimpanzees, our closest genetic relatives, struggle with. Dogs can distinguish between a genuine human smile and a fake one. They can pick up on subtle shifts in tone of voice, body language, and even changes in human scent associated with stress or fear, sometimes well before the human themselves has consciously registered feeling stressed or afraid. This isn't some vague, mystical bond. This is measurable, testable cognitive adaptation, and it happened because over tens of thousands of years, the dogs that were better at reading humans and better at responding appropriately to what they read got fed more, protected more, and allowed to breed more. It's natural selection, except instead of selecting for the sharpest claws or the fastest sprint speed, humans were unintentionally selecting for emotional literacy generation after generation for tens of thousands of years straight. So when a dog does something like waking up a sleeping family during a house fire, or persistently, anxiously pawing at an owner right before a medical emergency like a seizure or a heart attack, this isn't purely instinct in the same automatic, hardwired way the dolphin example is. This is closer to a genuinely learned, socially embedded relationship where the dog has spent years building an intricate model of this specific human, their normal behavior, their normal scent, their normal routine, and something falling drastically outside that model triggers a real active response. There's solid research suggesting dogs can detect certain diseases, including some cancers and the specific chemical shifts that precede epileptic seizures, purely through scent, sometimes with an accuracy that outperforms expensive diagnostic lab equipment. Some dogs display alerting behaviors before a seizure even begins, giving their owners crucial minutes to get to safety or take preventive medication. Nobody trained these dogs to do this in most documented cases. They just noticed over months or years of close cohabitation that something was chemically different about their person right before something bad happened, and they figured out entirely on their own initiative that making a fuss about it produced a better outcome. It's worth pausing here to appreciate just how strange this actually is. A dog isn't reasoning through cancer biology, it has no idea what a tumor is, no concept of malignant cell growth, absolutely zero medical training. It just knows on some deep, pattern-recognizing level that its person smells subtly wrong compared to yesterday, and wrong is worth investigating. That's not a party trick. That's tens of thousands of years of selective pressure quietly producing a walking, tail-wagging diagnostic tool that nobody designed on purpose. Now let's talk about elephants, because elephant rescue behavior takes us into genuinely different territory, and honestly into some of the most emotionally complicated animal cognition research out there. Elephants possess something researchers increasingly believe qualifies as a real, substantive form of empathy, not just an instinctive reflex, but something closer to actual emotional understanding and intentional care. Elephants have been observed engaging in behavior toward injured or distressed members of their own herd that looks remarkably deliberate, standing guard over a sick or dying herd member, using their trunks to gently touch and comfort them, and in some genuinely striking documented cases appearing to grieve over the remains of deceased herd members long after death, sometimes returning to the same spot repeatedly over months or even years. This is not typical animal behavior. This is a level of apparent emotional complexity that puts elephants in a pretty exclusive club alongside species like great apes and certain cetaceans, and this capacity for empathy appears to extend outward to humans in some genuinely remarkable documented cases. There are recorded instances of elephants protecting humans from danger, including cases of elephants forming a protective circle around a human during a threatening situation involving other wildlife, mirroring the exact same protective circling behavior elephants use to shield vulnerable herd members like calves. There are also documented cases of elephants appearing to recognize and respond to human distress signals, behaving with noticeable gentleness and caution around injured or vulnerable humans in ways that suggest genuine situational awareness rather than pure programmed instinct. Researchers studying elephant cognition increasingly argue that elephants may possess something close to what's called theory of mind, the ability to recognize that another being has its own internal state, its own fears, its own suffering, separate from your own. If that's genuinely true and the research increasingly leans that direction, then elephant rescue behavior toward humans might represent one of the closest things in the animal kingdom to an actual moral choice, rather than pure automatic instinct. That's a pretty wild thing to sit with for a second. An animal, completely unrelated to us evolutionarily, potentially making something resembling a conscious ethical decision to help a member of an entirely different species, purely because it seems to recognize suffering when it sees it. And elephants have exceptionally long memories to go along with that empathy, which adds another layer entirely. There are documented cases of elephants recognizing and behaving gently toward specific individual humans who had helped them or their herd years earlier, suggesting the relationship isn't just a one-time reflexive response, but something closer to an actual, tracked social bond, maintained across years the same way you might remember a person who once did you a solid favor a long time ago. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. But let's zoom out for a moment, because there's actually a broader evolutionary framework that helps explain a huge chunk of this phenomenon across many different species at once. And it's a concept that sounds almost too clean and simple to be true, but keeps showing up again and again in the research. Reciprocal altruism and its close cousin, generalized empathy circuits. Here's the deal. A lot of highly social animals, meaning animals that live in tight-knit groups and depend heavily on cooperation for survival, evolved neurological and behavioral systems specifically built around recognizing distress and responding to it with helping behavior. This makes complete evolutionary sense within a species, because in a cooperative social group, individuals who help distressed group members tend to receive help themselves later, and groups that reliably support struggling members simply outperform and outsurvive groups that don't. Over enough generations, this creates strong selective pressure favoring individuals with robust, active, help a struggling group member instincts. The genuinely fascinating part is that these instincts, once they evolve, don't always come with a strict built-in species filter. They evolved to respond to signals of distress, things like specific vocalizations, particular struggling movements, submissive or vulnerable body postures, and those signals, it turns out, are often surprisingly similar across many different species, especially among mammals, because we all share a lot of the same underlying neurological wiring for expressing fear, pain, and distress. So when a human ends up signaling distress in a way that happens to trigger another species' built-in helping instinct, whether that's the specific way a drowning human thrashes, or the specific way an injured human cries out, that instinct can fire regardless of species, because it was never really coded for help only members of my exact species in the first place. It was coded much more broadly for something closer to vulnerable creatures signaling distress, respond with help, and humans, being mammals ourselves, apparently trip that wire a lot more often than you'd expect. This actually explains some of the genuinely bizarre, headline-grabbing cases you might have heard about, like beluga whales retrieving objects dropped by human divers, or specific documented cases of humpback whales appearing to actively protect other species, including humans, from orca attacks, sometimes going so far as tucking a smaller animal or a diver underneath a pectoral fin, a behavior humpbacks are already well known for doing to protect their own calves. Researchers studying this exact behavior have documented humpback whales intervening in orca hunts targeting completely unrelated species: seals, sea lions, even sunfish, seemingly not because of any direct benefit to the humpback whale itself, but because something about a distress signal or an active predation event triggers an ingrained protective response that clearly isn't limited strictly to their own species or even their own genus. There's also a more specific and honestly kind of poignant angle worth mentioning here: the uncanny valley of familiarity. A lot of animal rescue behavior toward humans seems to happen specifically because certain human traits and behaviors closely resemble traits or behaviors within the rescuing animal's own species or social circle. Primates, for example, share such deeply overlapping social and emotional signaling with humans, given our close evolutionary relationship, that documented cases of primates protecting or assisting injured humans, including some remarkable, well-documented cases involving zoo gorillas gently guarding an unconscious child who had fallen into their enclosure, make a lot more intuitive sense once you understand just how much overlapping social and emotional wiring we actually share with our primate relatives. A gorilla reading human vulnerability isn't nearly as far of a stretch as a dolphin doing it, because gorillas and humans share so much more of the same fundamental social communication toolkit to begin with. A crying, curled up, clearly distressed small human to a gorilla's brain probably isn't reading all that differently from a distressed infant of its own species. And that overlap alone might explain an enormous chunk of these particular stories. It's also worth mentioning a related, slightly less glamorous but equally important angle: familiarity and bonding through repeated contact. This is a huge part of why rescue behavior shows up so much more frequently in domesticated species and in animals that have spent significant time around specific humans compared to genuinely wild animals with zero prior contact. A farm horse pulling a stuck child out of danger, a house cat waking up an owner during a gas leak, a pet pig alerting neighbors to a house fire, these cases share a common thread that's easy to overlook. The animal had an existing relationship with the specific human involved built over time through repeated positive interaction. That relationship doesn't just produce affection in some vague sentimental sense. It produces a genuinely detailed behavioral model of what normal looks like for that particular human, which makes it dramatically easier for the animal to notice when something is seriously wrong and to feel motivated enough to actually act on it. Now, I do want to add an important dose of scientific caution here, because it's genuinely easy for this topic to slide into overly romanticized territory, the kind of thing that ends up as an oversimplified, feel-good viral post, rather than an accurate reflection of what's actually happening. Not every animal rescue story holds up to rigorous scrutiny. Confirmation bias plays a real role here. When a dolphin pushes a struggling swimmer toward shore, that story gets told and retold for years. When a dolphin pushes a struggling swimmer further out to sea, which does happen since dolphins aren't actually reasoning through human geography or the location of the nearest beach, that story tends to get quietly forgotten because it doesn't fit the heartwarming narrative we already want to believe. Researchers studying this phenomenon are always careful to point out that we're likely seeing a pretty significant selection bias in which stories get told, retold, and eventually go viral. Animals aren't infallible lifeguards with a perfect rescue success rate. They're just occasionally genuinely helpful in ways that happen to align with what humans desperately want to be true, and the failures, understandably, don't make for quite as compelling a headline. There's also an important, sobering distinction to draw between genuine altruistic rescue behavior and behavior that just superficially resembles it, but is actually driven by something else entirely, like curiosity, territorial behavior, or even accidental byproducts of aggressive or dominant behavior that happen to have a beneficial outcome for the human involved purely by coincidence. Some documented rescues almost certainly fall into this murkier, more ambiguous category where the honest, less exciting answer is closer to the animal was investigating something novel and unfamiliar in its environment, rather than the animal made a conscious decision to save a human life. A dolphin nudging a swimmer might be curiosity rather than compassion. A large animal standing near an injured hiker might simply be confused rather than protective. Science, as usual, tends to be a lot messier and less clean-cut than the viral video captions would have you believe, and any honest exploration of this topic has to sit with that uncertainty rather than paper over it. That said, even with all of that appropriate scientific caution and skepticism factored in, there remains a genuinely solid, well-documented core of cases across multiple, completely unrelated species: dolphins, elephants, dogs, various primates, and even certain whales, where the evidence for real, intentional, risk-taking rescue behavior directed specifically at struggling or endangered humans is honestly pretty compelling and difficult to fully explain away through pure coincidence or misattributed intent. And what makes this genuinely remarkable, rather than just a fun collection of viral animal videos, is what it reveals about the surprisingly deep, surprisingly ancient roots of empathy and cooperative behavior across the entire animal kingdom. Empathy, it increasingly appears, isn't some unique, special trait that evolution invented exclusively for humans and then generously handed down to a small, exclusive club of particularly clever species as an afterthought. It's a much older, much more broadly distributed evolutionary tool, one that shows up again and again independently across wildly different branches of the animal family tree, wherever cooperative social living happened to provide a genuine, measurable survival advantage. There's one more layer worth mentioning before we wrap up, because it flips the whole question slightly on its head. It's worth asking why humans, of all species, seem to be on the receiving end of so much of this cross-species rescue behavior in the first place. More so, it seems, than most other animals get from one another. Part of the answer is almost embarrassingly simple. We're everywhere. Humans have inserted themselves into nearly every ecosystem on the planet, which means we're simply present, constantly, in situations where distress signals might get picked up by nearby animals, in a way that most other species never experience with each other, since most wild animals don't share territory with quite so many different, unrelated species at once. Part of the answer is also that a huge number of these documented rescues involve species that have some history of interaction with humans already, whether through domestication, captivity, or repeated proximity in shared habitats, which means the opportunity for a relationship, or at least mutual recognition, to form in the first place is dramatically higher than it would be between two wild species that rarely cross paths. So the next time you see a viral clip of a dog pulling a toddler away from a swimming pool, or a herd of elephants gently, deliberately guiding a lost, disoriented tourist back toward safety, or a dolphin nudging an exhausted swimmer all the way to shore, you can appreciate that story on two levels simultaneously. Yes, it's a genuinely heartwarming moment, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with enjoying it exactly as heartwarming, uncomplicated content. But it's also a small, real glimpse into something much bigger and stranger. Millions of years of evolutionary history, quietly building emotional and social wiring in wildly different species. Wiring that occasionally, unpredictably, reaches across the boundary between species entirely and decides, for reasons that are still only partially understood, that a struggling human life is worth the effort of saving. We didn't earn that. We didn't specifically evolve to deserve it, at least not in any deliberate, planned sense. We just happen to share enough overlapping biology, enough overlapping distress signals, and enough overlapping social wiring with a surprising number of other species that every now and then something in their brain looks at something in our very human, very vulnerable panic and decides, quite possibly without any true human-style, in-depth conscious reasoning involved at all, that this particular creature is worth helping. And honestly, whether that decision comes wrapped in genuine, deliberate empathy or pure evolutionary autopilot, the outcome for the person standing there, alive, safe, and breathing, ends up looking exactly the same either way. Which is, when you really sit with it, one of the stranger and more comforting facts about sharing a planet with creatures that never asked to be responsible for us in the first place.